Somewhere in Europe, roughly 50,000 years ago, a Neanderthal woke up. That's it. That's the whole sentence. And somehow that single ordinary moment is one of the most fascinating and frustrating mysteries in all of human prehistory. We know so much about Neanderthals now compared to what we knew even 20 years ago. We have their bones, their tools, their campsites, the chemical signatures left in their teeth, the pollen pressed into ancient sediments, the burned seeds on the floors of hearths that went cold before our species could walk, talk, or draw a single line on a cave wall. We have fragments. We have clues. We have enough to make an educated reconstruction of something that looks almost like a day. Almost. But here's the thing that keeps researchers up at night, and maybe it'll keep you company too, wherever you're drifting off right now. The most interesting mysteries aren't hiding in the big dramatic questions. They're hiding in the mundane ones. Not did Neanderthals survive, or did they feel grief, or did they bury their dead? Those are the headlines. The real strangeness is in the small stuff. What happened in the first hour after they woke up? Who decided what to do that morning? Was there a moment of just sitting there, quiet, looking at the fire? What does an ordinary Tuesday look like when you're a species that lasted 400,000 years on a planet that was actively trying to kill you? That's what this is about. Not the exceptional, the ordinary. Now, before we go any further, a quick pause. If you're listening to this at night, in bed, maybe with the lights already off, I make these for exactly that purpose. So tell me where you are and what time it is. Drop it in the comments. There's something genuinely wonderful about knowing that someone in Stockholm is hearing this at 2 in the morning while someone in New Zealand is listening over breakfast. You're all listening to the same ancient silence, I'll take that. So let's be honest about what we're working with. When archaeologists dig up a Neanderthal site, they're not finding a story. They're finding punctuation marks left behind by lives that were mostly invisible. Stone tools survive because stone is almost indestructible. Bones survive under the right conditions, dry caves, mineral-rich sediments, the right kind of cold. Charcoal survives. Ochre survives. Certain plant residues trapped on tool edges survive with careful analysis. What doesn't survive is almost everything else. Wood rots. Leather crumbles. Spoken words vanish the instant they're made. Emotions, intentions, habits, routines, the texture of daily life, all of it disappears unless it leaves some kind of physical mark. So every reconstruction you'll hear in what follows is a blend of two things, evidence and inference, and we'll be careful to tell you which is which, because Neanderthals have spent enough time being misunderstood. For over a century, the default image was a stooped, grunting brute dragging knuckles across a cave floor. That image is wrong. The fossil and archaeological record has spent the last few decades quietly dismantling it, piece by piece. What's emerging instead is something more complicated and honestly more interesting. A species with large brains, complex social lives, sophisticated tools, probable language, and a physical toughness that makes the strongest athletes alive today look a little soft. These were not primitive people. They were a different kind of people. And reconstructing even one day of their lives requires us to hold two things at once. Genuine scientific humility about the limits of evidence and genuine imaginative reach toward what that evidence is trying to show us. What we'll do in the sections ahead is move through a single day, not a crisis day, not the day they encountered our ancestors for the first time, or the day something catastrophic happened. Just a regular day, morning through night, waking up, tending fire, planning movement, gathering food, working stone, caring for children and the injured, sitting around a fire in the dark, maybe making sounds that weren't quite language and weren't quite not. The camera, so to speak, will stay close, ground level, personal, and when we can see the evidence clearly, we'll say so. When we're extrapolating, reading between the lines of broken flint and scattered ash, we'll say that too. Because the most respectful thing we can do for a species that walked this earth for 400,000 years is to look carefully, speak honestly, and resist the urge to make them simpler than they were. So, let's go back. It's just before dawn, and somewhere under a limestone overhang a fire is dying down to coals. Before we follow anyone out of that shelter, it's worth asking exactly what kind of shelter we're talking about. Because when most people picture a Neanderthal home, they picture a cave. Dark mouth in a cliff face, bones on the floor, fire somewhere toward the back, and sometimes that's right, but sometimes it isn't, and the difference matters. Neanderthals ranged across an enormous stretch of the world. from the Atlantic coast of what is now Portugal to the Altai Mountains of Siberia. From the cold steppes of northern Europe down into the Levant, into what is now Iraq and Iran, into the fringes of Central Asia. The landscapes they occupied were as varied as the planet itself: dense forest with mixed oak and birch canopy, open grassland swept by wind carrying dust from glaciers just a few hundred miles north, river valleys lush with game during mild periods and locked in deep cold during glacial maxima, Mediterranean coastlines where the sea temperature dropped significantly, but the hunting remained rich. No single image covers all of it. The climate across Ice Age Eurasia was not one thing either. It was a long series of oscillations, warmer periods that could last thousands of years, cold periods that tightened their grip slowly and then sometimes broke hard and fast. During the coldest phases, glaciers pushed down from Scandinavia as far as northern Germany and Britain. The landscape south of the ice was open and exposed, a kind of cold steppe that supported enormous herds of woolly mammoth, woolly rhinoceros, bison, reindeer, cave bear, cave lion. During warmer interstadials, forests advanced and the prey species changed with them. Red deer and aurochs moved in where reindeer had been. A Neanderthal group had to track all of that. Not intellectually, not on any map, but in the accumulated knowledge of where the herds were last season and the season before, where water ran year-round, where the wind came from in winter. Now, the shelters. Caves do show up frequently in the archaeological record, but partly for a reason that has nothing to do with Neanderthal preference. Caves preserve things. Of rock shelters, which are shallower overhangs cut by water or erosion into cliff faces, preserve almost as well and were probably more common as actual living spaces. They gave you a roof and a back wall and an open front, which actually makes more practical sense than a deep cave if you're trying to watch the landscape, tend a fire and move quickly if you need to. But open-air sites also exist, places where Neanderthals camped in the open, sometimes repeatedly over generations, near river crossings or spring sources or flint outcrops worth returning to. These sites are harder to read because erosion, agriculture and simple time have scrambled the evidence. But they're there. Marks in the sediment, burned patches, clustering of worked stone, the footprint of a group of people who didn't have limestone overhead and apparently didn't need it. What archaeologists look for when they excavate these places is something called a living floor, a layer in the sediment where human activity was concentrated in a specific period. Within that layer they map hearth zones, areas of burned bone and charcoal and reddened sediment that mark where fire was maintained. Around those hearths, they look at how tools are distributed. Were the large cutting tasks happening here near the fire or over there at the edge of the shelter? Is the butchery debris concentrated in one spot, while the delicate flint knapping happened somewhere else? These spatial patterns are the closest thing we have to a floor plan. What those plans suggest is organization, not random scatter, zones of activity that imply habits and probably social arrangements. Someone's spot, someone else's task. The kind of daily choreography that emerges when a group of people share a small space over time, and they probably didn't share that space for too long in one stretch. Neanderthals were, as best we can tell, seasonally mobile. They followed resources. When the herd moved, the group moved. When a rock shelter became cold or the local hunting ground thinned out, they went somewhere else. Possibly somewhere they'd been before, possibly a site the group had used for generations. Some sites show repeated occupation across thousands of years. Not continuous habitation, but return. The same overhang, visited again and again, like a familiar place held in collective memory. So home on any given morning might have been this rock shelter, or next month, a different one, 3 days' walk to the southeast where the aurochs tend to be in autumn. The concept of home was probably less fixed point and more known landscape, a network of places that made sense together, a territory carried not on any map but in the minds of the people moving through it. So picture one of those mornings. The group has been at this rock shelter for maybe 2 weeks, long enough that the sleeping arrangements have settled into something habitual. The people who run coldest are closest to the fire. The ones who wake easiest are probably near the opening, where the light comes first and the sounds of the landscape carry in. They were almost certainly sleeping in contact with each other, not out of preference necessarily, but out of thermal necessity. A single body loses heat to the ground all night. 2 bodies together lose significantly less. A cluster of bodies sharing breath and warmth under whatever coverings they had, that was survival arithmetic. The bedding itself we can only reconstruct from logic and a few provocative finds. Sediment analysis at certain Neanderthal sites has revealed traces of compacted plant material, grasses, fern-like leaves, bark. Not definitive proof of prepared bedding, but consistent with it. The alternative is sleeping directly on rock and cold earth, which is something humans will do when they have to and avoid when they have any choice. Neanderthals made choices. They selected sleeping locations with overhead cover. They managed fire. There is no strong reason to think they wouldn't have gathered soft material to lie on. Windbreaks are harder to find archaeologically. Organic materials rot. Hides lashed between poles, branches stacked against a cliff face. Nothing like that survives 50,000 years. But the positioning of hearths within rock shelters, often set back from the open face, and the spatial distribution of sleeping areas relative to fire and entrance, these suggest intentional arrangement. Cold air falls and flows. Anyone who has slept outside knows exactly which direction the wind comes from by the second night. A Neanderthal group camped in a place for 2 weeks absolutely knew. Now, the fire. One of the first things that happens at dawn, possibly before anyone is fully conscious, is a check on the embers. Fire was not easy to start. Percussion fire starting, striking flint against iron pyrite to generate sparks, works, but it takes skill and dry tinder, and sometimes it takes a frustrating amount of time. Maintaining a coal overnight was far more efficient than relighting from scratch every morning. So someone banks the fire before sleeping. Someone checks it at first light. This is probably not an assigned role in any formal sense. It's more likely just the habit of whoever is awake, whoever sleeps lightest, whoever emerged first. But it was not optional. A dead fire on a cold morning in glacial Europe was a problem that needed solving immediately. While the embers were being coaxed back, there would have been listening. This is something we tend to undervalue when we reconstruct early human mornings, because we live in a world so saturated with our own noise. But in that landscape, sound carried information that could mean the difference between eating well and going hungry, or between being the predator and encountering one. Cave lions were real. Cave hyenas were real. The sound of horses moving in the valley below meant something. The silence of birds that had been calling a moment ago meant something else. This kind of environmental reading was not a skill you learned from a manual. It was built through years of attention, trained into the nervous system of anyone who had grown up in that landscape. Weather reading was the same. Ice Age mornings come with signals. The colour of the eastern horizon before sunrise, which direction the clouds are moving, whether the air smells like coming snow. These signals are learnable, and in a world where a decision to travel or hunt or stay could be shaped by afternoon weather, reading them well was a genuine cognitive asset. A Neanderthal group waking up was not just regaining consciousness. They were taking stock of the world they woke into. Season shaped everything about when and how they woke. In deep winter at higher European latitudes, usable daylight was limited, maybe 8 hours or fewer. You don't waste it. Energy budgeting becomes severe. The calories available versus the calories burned in cold were a constant equation in the background of every decision. Do we go out? How far? Is it worth it today? Conversely, in summer the night shortened to almost nothing, and the pressure ran the other direction, toward covering distance, processing food, preparing for the winter that was already coming. The bodies doing all of this carry their own record. Neanderthal skeletons are remarkable documents. The bones are dense, the muscle attachment points are heavily pronounced, the joint surfaces show wear patterns consistent with extreme and repetitive loading. These were not people who occasionally strained themselves. These were people whose bodies were under sustained mechanical stress for their entire lives. Healed fractures are common. Injuries to the shoulder and elbow that look specifically like the kind of trauma generated by thrusting a heavy spear into large resistant animals, arthritis in joints of adults who are not especially old, at least not old by our standards. What this tells us about mornings is something practical. There were almost certainly people in that group who woke up stiff and sore in a way that required movement before they were fully functional. There were people with healed injuries that ached in cold weather. There were probably older individuals for whom the cold floor and the long night had extracted a toll that needed working off before the day could begin. The robust Neanderthal body was built for endurance, but endurance has a cost, and some of that cost was paid in the slow mornings. And yet there is nothing in the evidence that suggests dysfunction or fragility. These were people who survived to adulthood and middle age and sometimes beyond under conditions that killed the unprepared. They were capable. The physical evidence is of hard use over a long time, not of bodies breaking down. So the morning begins, embers glowing back to flame. Someone moving to the edge of the shelter to read the sky. The smell of cold air and old fire and the particular damp smell of people who have been sleeping together in a small space. Children probably slow to wake the way children always are. Someone already thinking about where the reindeer were yesterday, whether the trail east was worth walking this morning. The day hasn't started yet. The decisions haven't been made. But the world is already being read, the fire is already being fed, and the group is already doing what it has always done, taking stock and preparing to move through a landscape that is beautiful and cold and full of both possibility and danger. If you look at the ground of a Neanderthal living space that archaeologists have carefully peeled back layer by layer, the fire shows itself first. Not as a roaring blaze, of course, but as patterns in ash and charcoal, repeated circular stains where hearths once sat. Thin, pale layers of ash stacked one over the other like the pages of a book, each page a separate episode of burning. At some sites you see not just one hearth but many, renewed in almost exactly the same spot over and over. The ash spreads a little, drifts with wind and footsteps, but the centre holds. That kind of repetition is not random. It tells us the fire was anchored. This is where heat lives. This is where light lives. This is where we cook and work and talk. Around those circles of ash, the rest of the camp organises itself. In some rock shelters, the distribution is almost startlingly neat. Burned bone and food scraps cluster near the hearth. Stone flakes lie in arcs where people sat napping tools. Sleeping areas begin a little distance away where ash thins and soil chemistry shifts. Even after tens of thousands of years, the pattern is legible. Fire in the middle, life radiating out from it. But what those fires were made of depended entirely on the world outside that shelter. In some places, especially forested valleys and river corridors, dry wood would have been the obvious choice. Branches collected on the way back to camp. Deadfalls scavenged from trees, maybe the occasional larger log dragged closer and fed to the flames over days. In open steppe and tundra, where trees shrank to low shrubs or vanished altogether, fuel becomes more interesting. There people may have burned bone, the greasy, marrow-rich pieces that smoulder hot when ordinary wood is scarce. In some regions, especially closer to glaciated plains, animal dung is a strong candidate. Dried patties from reindeer, horses or bison, gathered and stacked and lit the way modern pastoralists still do in treeless environments. We don't see the fuel directly, but we see the traces. Microscopic analysis of some hearths shows mineral signatures consistent with burned bone. Others carry silica structures from plants. In still others, the chemistry hints at dung fires, though that interpretation is debated. What is consistent is that Neanderthals were not just striking sparks at whatever they found. They were making choices, adjusting fuel strategy to the landscape, the season, and probably the type of fire they needed. Quick heat for cooking, long slow coals for warmth, bright flame for light. Because fire was not one thing in their day. It was many. It was warmth, obviously. In Ice Age Europe and Western Asia, a day without fire in winter was a day spent burning through body fat and muscle just to keep core temperature up. A stable hearth turned a rock shelter, or a hut, into a survivable microclimate. You sleep closer or farther depending on the season. You dry damp hides and clothing beside it. You thaw frozen meat and soften cured leather in its heat. It was also cooking. The bones around Neanderthal hearths are often cracked and burned in ways that suggest roasting and marrow extraction. Charred plant remains at some sites hint at tubers, and seeds being heated as well. Cooking changes everything. It makes meat safer, plants more digestible, calories easier to access. An animal taken down miles from camp is not fully edible until it has passed through this circle of heat. Fire was a workshop tool too. Heat-treating certain kinds of stone improves their flaking properties, making finer blades and points possible. There's evidence that Neanderthals sometimes did exactly this, placing raw material nearer in the fire before napping. The production of birch tar, a sticky adhesive used to haft stone tools onto wooden shafts, almost certainly required controlled heating. At least one Neanderthal tar fragment shows a method that implies careful management of temperature and exclusion of oxygen. That sort of process is unthinkable without a practiced relationship to flame and ember. Then there is light. Winter days at high latitudes are short. Without artificial light, productive time collapses. A hearth extends the day into the evening, not just for socializing but for work. Repairing spears, scraping hides, resharpening tools, plaiting fibers. Activities that don't require full daylight can spill into firelit hours. Around a Neanderthal hearth you can imagine a ring of partial tusks, each picked up and put down as daylight fades and returns. Fire was also a kind of perimeter. Large predators are generally fire-averse. A burning hearth near the entrance to a rock shelter, smoke drifting out, scent and light marking the space, likely reduced the probability of a curious hyena or lion approaching too close at night. It didn't make them safe in any absolute sense, but it skewed the odds. In a world where risk is everywhere, skewing the odds matters. All of this raises a question that archaeologists have been arguing about for decades. How often were Neanderthals making fire from scratch, and how often were they nursing it along, preserving embers from one day to the next, one camp to the next? We know they had the technology for fire-making in at least some times and places. Flint struck against iron-rich minerals can produce sparks, and the presence of these minerals in association with hearths is suggestive. Experimental work shows it's entirely feasible. But feasible is not the same as routine. A single piece of iron pyrite in a site tells us they could do it, not how often they actually did. Ethnographic parallels from recent hunter-gatherers show a clear pattern. When fire is hard to start, you treat embers like treasure. You bank the coals carefully under ash at night, insulate them with dry material, sometimes carry them glowing in containers when you move camp. Some Neanderthal sites show thick, reworked hearth deposits that fit with long-term ember management rather than frequent cold starts. Others, where hearths are small and scattered, might represent short stays and more casual burning. Certainty varies. At some caves, the density and continuity of burnt layers make fire maintenance feel almost obvious. At open-air sites with more fragmented evidence, it's harder to tell. What seems safe to say is that both strategies existed. Sometimes a group maintained fire obsessively. Sometimes they were willing to let it go out knowing they could restart it if necessary. Which one dominated in daily life probably shifted with season, fuel availability, and the confidence and skill of whoever knew the trick of sparking tinder to life. Whatever the exact balance, tending fire imposed its own rhythm on the day. Someone had to stir the coals now and then, feed in more fuel, judge when a log needed to be rolled or a pot, if they had one in a given period, to be moved closer. Someone noticed when smoke thickened and drifted the wrong way in the shelter, when sparks threatened a hide laid too near. This probably wasn't a formal job any more than checking the embers at dawn was, but people fall into patterns. A person who disliked long hunts, or who moved less easily on rough ground, might spend more time near the hearth, becoming, over years, the one who simply knew fire best. Older individuals, children on the cusp of real responsibility, injured hunters recovering strength. These are all plausible fire tenders. In a small group, everyone would have known how, but not everyone would have done it equally. Tasks organize themselves around the certainty that the hearth will be there. Morning plans, who goes to scout for game, who gathers plant foods, who stays to repair tools, are made with the expectation that when people return cold, wet and tired, a pocket of warmth and light awaits. Midday someone might come back early to drop off meat or fetch more fuel, checking the fire as automatically as we check a phone. Evening is structured around it, cooking, eating, talking, or just staring into the coals and letting muscles cool and minds wander. So as the morning unfolds in that rock shelter, the fire that was coaxed back from embers at dawn doesn't just sit there passively. It is the quiet metronome of the day, the fixed point around which movement flows out and returns. Whatever happens, hunt, forage, weather shift, a decision to move camp, will be decided in its orbit. Before anyone actually walks out into that cold, bright world with a spear in hand, there is a period of thinking. Not abstract, armchair thinking, but the kind that comes from living inside a landscape long enough that your body remembers it. The conversation might start very simply, there at the edge of the hearth's light. Someone mentions what they saw yesterday on the ridgeline. Someone else talks about the state of the snow, whether it carried their weight or broke under every step. A half-burnt bone from last week's kill is turned in a hand, its marrow long since eaten, its size and shape an implicit reminder of what is possible out there. Evidence for this kind of planning doesn't fossilize as clearly as a spear point or a skull, but we can infer pieces of it, On Ice Age plains, herds are not random. Reindeer, bison, horses, mammoth, they follow paths, seasonal migrations, the pull of greener valleys and safer calving grounds. Modern reindeer still pour through the same mountain passes year after year. There is no reason to think Pleistocene herds behaved very differently, and every reason to think Neanderthals noticed. So, planning the hunt likely began with seasonality. In late autumn, when animals are heavy with fat and moving toward wintering grounds, the odds of a successful large kill probably climbed. In deep winter, starving herds might be easier to approach but harder to find, scattered and wary on wind-scoured slopes. Spring brings pregnant females, young animals on uncertain legs, but also softer ground and meltwater streams that can erase tracks and bog down a chase. Tracks mattered. We know Neanderthals butchered and processed animals with enough thoroughness to leave distinctive cut marks on bones. To get to that point routinely, they had to find those animals in the first place. On frozen ground, hoofprints are sharp and durable. In wet soils, they smear and deform. In fresh snow, they write the morning's movements in clean, dark dents. Reading those signs, how fresh they looked, how deep, how many animals passed, would have been as basic as reading letters is to us. The terrain was part of the equation too. A flat, open plain is not a Neanderthal hunter's friend if their primary weapon is a thrusting spear. We have a lot of evidence that Neanderthals got very close to large animals, close enough that their skeletons sometimes show trauma consistent with heavy impacts and falls, the kind of injuries you see in modern rodeo riders and big game hunters. That points towards short-range weapons and dangerous encounters, not leisurely sniping from a distance. So you imagine them thinking with the landscape. That ravine where herds tend to funnel as they move between grazing areas, that narrow river crossing forced by steep banks, that patch of broken limestone where footing is treacherous for hooves but manageable for human feet that have learned every rock. Those places become natural ambush points, places you can plan around rather than improvising an open country. Archaeology gives us glimpses of this strategy. At some sites, the age and sex profiles of animal bones suggest targeted hunting rather than random scavenging. Many bones belong to prime-age adults, the hardest animals to kill but also the biggest payoff in meat and fat. At other sites, we see accumulation of a single species that tends to move in herds, like reindeer or bison, implying repeated exploitation of the same behavioral pattern. It is easier to imagine these as the results of deliberate drives or ambushes than as a long series of accidents. Group coordination would have been essential. A single hunter with a spear is dangerous up close. Several moving together, flanking, blocking escape routes, become something more like a pack of wolves that talk to each other. One or two individuals might circle wide before dawn to take up positions behind a herd's likely line of retreat. Others might approach from downwind, visible enough to apply pressure, but not so close as to trigger a full, panicked stampede in the wrong direction. At a signal, a shout, a thrown stone, or just the sudden movement of bodies, the herd surges toward the chosen gap in the terrain, where more hunters wait. We can't hear their calls, but we see hints of this choreography in the bones. Piles of skeletal remains in sinkholes, and at the bases of steep slopes suggest animals driven over edges. Blended layers of trampled sediment and butchered bone imply kill zones used more than once. At some locations, the distribution of animal parts looks as if carcasses were processed on site, and then portions carried back to camp, a pattern you'd expect if the killing ground lay some distance away, and the group had to decide, right there, what to haul. Stone tools add more pieces to the puzzle. Neanderthal points often show damage concentrated at their tips and along specific edges, consistent with high-impact thrusting into dense material like bone. Microscopic wear patterns, tiny polish zones and striations suggest repeated use in stabbing rather than just cutting. Some stone points appear to have been hafted onto wooden shafts with adhesives and bindings, creating composite weapons. These are not casual one-off improvisations. They look like tools produced with the expectation that they will be driven hard into large bodies. Faunal assemblages from Neanderthal sites tilt heavily toward big mammals. There are smaller animals too, rabbits, birds, but over and over, the bulk of the meat comes from creatures that outweigh a human many times over. That focus on large game brings obvious rewards. One successful hunt can feed a small group for days, especially if the meat is dried or frozen. It also carries immense risk. A charging bison or a cornered rhinoceros can kill in seconds. Even non-fatal injuries, a broken limb, a deep puncture, could turn lethal in a world without hospitals. The injuries preserved in Neanderthal bones hint at that cost. Healed fractures, crushed ribs, damaged skulls, sometimes in patterns eerily like modern contact sport athletes, suggest that people survived serious accidents and were cared for afterward. That, in turn, implies that when today's hunt is being planned, they are not only thinking about where to find animals, but who is healthy enough to participate. Role specialization probably emerged from those realities, even if it never hardened into formal jobs. Stronger, faster individuals might regularly take on the most dangerous close contact roles. Others might excel at reading tracks and wind, scouting ahead. Some might be better at butchering, knowing exactly where to cut to free heavy joints and high-fat organs. Older hunters carrying old injuries might guide and advise rather than sprint, their knowledge of migration routes and hidden approaches woven into the morning discussion. None of this would have been static. A hunting plan in a dense, temperate forest full of red deer and boar looks different from one on a treeless steppe shadowed by mammoth herds. Sites in southwestern Europe, the Levant, Central Asia, each show slightly different mixes of prey animals, different tool styles, different evidence of repeated kill locations or one-off events. Over the roughly 300,000 years Neanderthals existed, climates swung, ice advanced and retreated, coastlines shifted. A strategy that worked for one valley in one century might have needed adjustment or abandonment in the next. So we should imagine not the Neanderthal hunt, but many hunts, many local traditions and tweaks layered on top of a shared core, an intimate knowledge of animal behavior, a feel for season and terrain, a willingness to accept real danger in exchange for large, calorie-dense prizes, and a capacity to coordinate bodies and decisions in time and space. When the talking quiets and people stand, reaching for spears leaning against the rock wall, what leaves the shelter is not a random walk into the snow. It is a plan, assembled from tracks remembered, winds felt on skin, stories of past successes and failures, and the simple, pressing fact that the fire waiting back at camp burns hotter when there is meat to cook over it. Not everyone stands up when the hunters do. Some stay by the fire to tend children or aching joints. Others drift not toward the spears, but toward baskets, slings, and digging sticks. The day's plan is not only about hooves and horns, it's also about the quieter calories that rarely make headlines in the fossil record, but may have carried people through lean days more often than the dramatic, bloody moments did. For a long time, Neanderthals were painted as almost pure meat-eaters, stalking mammoth and bison while ignoring everything that didn't run on four legs. But the evidence has been filling in around the edges of that picture, and it suggests something more flexible. The most intimate clues come from their teeth. Dental calculus, the mineralized plaque that builds up along the gum line, sometimes preserves microscopic fragments of whatever a person chewed and swallowed across months or years. Under a microscope, those flakes become a kind of time capsule. In Neanderthal mouths, researchers have found plant starch grains, phytoliths, tiny silica bodies that form in plant tissues, and even traces of smoke-altered compounds. At some sites, the starches look like they came from grass seeds and legumes. At others, they match the signature of underground storage organs, tubers, bulbs, rhizomes. Many of those fragments show signs of having been heated before being eaten, their crystalline structure changed by cooking. That hints at a routine that did not end with digging something out of the ground. It continued through peeling, roasting in ash, simmering in some makeshift container. It suggests knowledge not only of this plant is edible, but this part is best in this season, and it's safer, tastier, or easier to digest if we treat it this way. Isotopic analyses of Neanderthal bones still lean heavily toward animal protein. Their nitrogen and carbon ratios often resemble those of apex carnivores in the same ecosystems, wolves, big cats. But isotopes are weighted toward the protein portion of the diet. A life built around meat does not exclude a constant background of plants, fungi, and nuts, especially when those foods are eaten in bursts, seasonally, or contribute more carbohydrates than protein. So the chemical signal in the bones and the microscopic crumbs in the tartar are not at odds. They're different views of the same flexible strategy. Around some cave and rock shelter sites, preserved plant remains back this up. In sediments and hearth dumps, researchers have found charred nutshells, seeds, bits of wild grasses and fractured acorns. Some bear scorch marks that look less like accidental burning and more like deliberate roasting. A bitter acorn or a tough seed can be transformed by heat. Tannins reduced, starches gelatinized. Those details don't appear accidentally. They point toward repeated trial and error, stories about which tree along which path drops the fattest nuts and which kind of root near which stream is worth the effort of digging. And then there is the kingdom of fungi and lichens. Traces of plant-derived compounds in dental calculus include signatures consistent with mushrooms and possibly medicinal plants. Interpretation here is cautious. Chemistry is a blunt tool. But the idea that Neanderthals walked past every edible or useful fungus on a forest floor while knowing the behavior of reindeer in exquisite detail seems increasingly unlikely. All of this knowledge would have been deeply seasonal. If you could lay out a Neanderthal year as a kind of shopping list, it would change colour month by month. Late summer and early autumn might bring a flush of berries, soft fruits, and nuts. Hazel and chestnut where those trees grew. Pine nuts in some regions. These are high-energy foods that store well, or at least better than tender greens. Hunters leaving camp in that season might pass trees already mentally tagged as future stops on the way back, branches remembered for their heavy clusters of ripening shells. Spring and early summer might be the time for fresh shoots, leafy greens, and those underground storage organs that swell over winter. In colder months, many plants put their reserves into roots and bulbs, hiding calories below the frost line. With a simple digging stick, a shaped branch hardened in the fire, you can pry up pieces of buried starch that help bridge the gaps between animal kills. Some ethnographic studies of recent hunter-gatherers suggest that roots and tubers can provide a remarkably stable portion of the diet, especially for children and elders who cannot always share in risky hunts. There is no reason to think Neanderthals lacked the intelligence or patience to exploit the same strategies. Gathering also extended into the realm of small, fast or awkward creatures that don't leave impressive piles of bones. Along coasts and river mouths where Neanderthals lived, we find accumulations of shellfish, limpets, mussels, clams, cracked open and discarded. In some levels, cut-marked fish bones appear. In others, bird bones with butchery traces or long, delicate wing bones that seem to have been removed for feathers as well as meat. Eggshells from waterfowl and other birds show scorching or breakage patterns consistent with human handling. These resources are not as spectacular as a mammoth, but they can be astonishingly reliable. Shellfish cling to rocks whether the reindeer migrate early or late. Birds nest on the same cliffs season after season. Long before a large game hunt returns, a small group could walk down to a tidal flat or along a rocky shore, fill baskets with protein and fat that cannot run away, and be back before midday. Even inland, small game, hares, ground-nesting birds, maybe even frogs or turtles, could be caught with simple traps, stones, or quick hands. They don't always show up in faunal lists in large numbers, but preservation biases and excavation histories skew what we see. A cracked hare bone left near the surface of a camp 100,000 years ago has a low chance of surviving. A mammoth femur buried deep in sediment has a much better one. Absence of evidence, especially with fragile creatures, is not evidence of absence. All of this quieter food acquisition shaped how people moved. A day's route might be plotted not just as out to the pass, watch for herds, but as a loop that passes a stand of nut trees, a sunlit slope where early greens appear, a damp hollow where you can probe for bulbs. Children too small to join a high-speed chase can walk along for the plant part. They can be shown which leaf shape means dig here, which bark means the nuts on this trunk are still bitter, which patch of ground always hides wasp nests that must be avoided. Their hands can help carry, sort, shell, and spread things to dry back at camp. In that sense, gathering is also teaching. The names of plants, if there were names, the stories about someone who got sick from eating the wrong mushroom, the memory of a cousin who found an unusually rich patch of roots, one particularly harsh winter. These all become part of the mental map that overlays the physical landscape. You imagine a child running ahead, stopping at a familiar rock, and proudly pointing out the first sprouting leaves of a plant their grandmother taught them to recognize. Calories and knowledge moving together along the same paths. While the hunter's day is punctuated by sharp moments of risk and decision, the gatherer's day is more continuous, bending, reaching, scanning the ground, checking known spots, probing new ones. There is room in that rhythm for talk, for quiet instruction, for the kind of observational learning that builds over years. Which trees drop their nuts earlier at this altitude, how the slope faces the sun, and what that does to the snow melt, whether last summer's drought has thinned the berry bushes this year. In a cold, marginal world, these subtler patterns could make the difference between a hungry winter and a survivable one. A failed hunt is less catastrophic if you have caches of dried berries, strings of mushrooms, baskets of roasted nuts, and cured fish stacked near the sleeping area. A decision to move camp is easier if you know, with some confidence, that 2 days' walk away there is a valley where the roots are thick and the shellfish beds are exposed at the right low tides. So while the spear points and butchered bones draw our attention, the daily, almost unnoticed actions of gathering and foraging probably provided the steady background against which the drama of the hunt played out. The routes they walked, the plants they knew, the small animals they could always fall back on, these wove Neanderthals into their landscapes just as tightly as any mammoth drive. By evening, when people trickle back toward the glow of the fire, arms full of meat or hands stained from berries and soil, those two strands of the day's work meet in the same place. The quieter calories and the dangerous ones come together on the same hearth, in the same shared meal, feeding not only bodies but the memories and stories that will guide tomorrow's choices. Near the centre of all this movement and gathering, there is another kind of work that keeps returning like a heartbeat: stone. At first glance, a Mousterian toolkit, the kind associated with Neanderthals across Europe and parts of Western Asia, can look underwhelming if you're used to later prehistory. No polished axes, no delicate microliths set into composite blades, just flakes, scrapers, points. But simple is one of those words that dissolves the closer you look. A sharp flake does not fall from a rock by accident in the shape you need. The tools in a Neanderthal camp are the end product of a chain of choices that might stretch back days, weeks, even seasons. Someone had to remember where a good seam of flint, chert, or quartzite lay along the valley wall. Someone had to carry heavy raw pieces back, or at least to an intermediate stop, knowing they might not be used immediately. Today, as people filter back toward the fire, some of that stone is coming home in slings, bags, or tucked under arms with the meat and plants. Tomorrow or next week, it will turn into edges. When napping happens during the day, it probably doesn't feel like a special event. It's woven into the pauses. A hunter waits while others scout a ravine. He leans against a rock and resharpens a dulled point. Someone minding a simmering pot of bones picks up a core and knocks off a fresh flake, checking the edge with a thumb. A teen who is not yet allowed to join the most dangerous part of the hunt sits with an elder, copying their gestures, learning how to read the angles in stone. Archaeologists call one of the hallmarks of Neanderthal technology prepared core or Levallois technique. The idea is straightforward, but the execution is anything but. Instead of randomly hammering a rock until something sharp appears, you shape a core with a particular geometry first, removing flakes here, thinning there, so that, when the moment is right, you can strike a single, well-placed blow and detach a flake with the size and curve you planned in advance. It's like carving the mould before you pour the metal, except the mould and the product are the same stone. At some sites, the resulting flakes, scrapers, and points are so standardized that researchers can group them into distinct types, repeated across layers and regions. That regularity suggests teaching, not improvisation. It suggests that this is what a good side scraper looks like was not just an individual opinion but a shared template, passed from hand to hand and generation to generation. Local styles emerge in the record too. One valley favours a certain way of shaping the core, another prefers slightly different angles or tool proportions. These differences map loosely onto geography, as if stoneworking traditions had dialects, spreading outward with marriages, visits, and exchanged tools, but maintaining a recognisable regional flavour. Within a single group's day, tool maintenance is probably one of the quieter, more meditative tasks. You can nap sitting down, wrapped in a cloak while watching children play at the edge of the light. You can retouch an edge while listening to someone recount the day's hunt. A chipped scraper that has lost its bite is not thrown away. Its edge is rejuvenated again and again until the whole piece is finally too small, at which point even that last sliver might serve as a drill, a piercer, a tiny cutting blade. This is part of planning ahead. A good hunter does not wait until a spear point shatters on bone to think about replacements. A good hide worker does not start scraping a heavy winter skin with a dull tool. Somewhere in camp there is likely a small pile of ready spares and another pile of promising cores, like a pantry of edges stored for future need. Some of those tools were more than just stone in the hand. By the middle and later stages of the Neanderthal record, the evidence for hafting, attaching stone pieces to wooden handles or shafts, is strong. We find points with microscopic wear and impact patterns consistent with use as spear tips, where the stress lines show they were fixed to something longer than a fist. Residues along edges include traces of plant resins and bitumen at some sites, suggesting that sticky substances were used as adhesives. Imagine the thought process behind that, recognizing that a gummy exudate from a tree or a tar-like seep from the ground could be heated, mixed, maybe combined with powdered charcoal or plant fibers, and used to glue a stone into a notch, then binding it with sinew or plant fiber so it holds under the shock of impact. Not every aspect of this is settled. Some claimed adhesive residues are debated. Contamination and later processes can confuse the chemical signature. There is ongoing discussion about how common complex hafting really was, and whether certain tool forms were routinely mounted on handles or only sometimes. But multiple lines of evidence, microwear, fracture patterns, residues, and the nature of the points themselves, converge on a picture in which Neanderthals were not just gripping naked rocks. They were building composite tools, combining materials in ways that required forethought and experimentation. Those tools did far more than kill animals. The Mousterian toolkit is rich in scrapers, broad-edged implements ideal for working hides. Taking the thick skin from a large herbivore and turning it into something soft enough to wrap around a sleeping child is a long, tedious process. Scraping away fat and flesh, stretching, possibly smoking or otherwise treating the hide, it all takes time and sharpness. The heavy representation of hide-working tools at many sites suggests that processing skins was not a marginal activity. It was a regular part of life, feeding into clothing, bedding and shelter. Other tools show wear consistent with woodworking, edges dulled and polished by shaving, gouging or smoothing wood fibers. We almost never find the wooden products themselves. They rot away unless conditions are extraordinary. But occasionally, preservation gives us a glimpse. A carefully carved spear from Schöningen in Germany, earlier than classic Neanderthals, but within the same broad tradition of human craftsmanship. Later, at Neanderthal sites, shaped digging sticks and spears, sharpened and sometimes fire-hardened. The stone tools are the ghost of an entire wooden world that once surrounded them. Handles, poles, pegs, frames, perhaps even simple sleds or racks. Plant processing leaves its own microscopic signature. Polish from cutting grasses or reeds, tiny striations from slicing soft stems, residue lodged along edges. Some Mousterian tools carry exactly these marks. They may have been used to harvest plants, strip bark, cut cords, or slice roots into pieces small enough to cook quickly. To eyes trained by experiment, these patterns separate themselves into categories. Here, a tool that mostly met hide. Here, one that spent its life on wood. Here, one that cut plant fibers again and again. In this sense, a Neanderthal toolkit is not a single generalized knife, but a set of specialists. Points designed to pierce, scrapers optimized to shave, notches perfect for cutting and smoothing shafts, burins that can incise or carve. A day might pass from one task to another, morning spent retipping spears, midday scraping yesterday's hides, afternoon trimming branches into usable poles. The same hands move from job to job, and the same stones shift roles as they are sharpened, reshaped, and reassigned. If you could sit among them quietly, listening to the soft clack of stone on stone and the faint hiss of flakes sliding down onto pile, you would be watching an invisible conversation with the past. Every gesture is learned from someone else. Every successful edge is proof that an idea about how stone behaves has been preserved intact across generations, and those edges will follow them into everything else they do, the clothes they wear, the shelters they sleep under, the way they cook and share their food when night comes and they gather once more around the fire. Stone is what we find. Stone is what fills the museum cases and the illustrations in books, what gets drawn and measured and given long Latin names, and it's what we've just spent time with, because it really was central to Neanderthal life. But if you could walk through their camp in the late afternoon, after the tools have done their work for the day, stone might actually feel like the minority material. Most of what you'd see would be wood, fibre, skin, bone, the things that almost never survive. Archaeology is a kind of selective memory. Hard, durable materials are overrepresented. Soft, perishable ones fade unless conditions are perfect. Fire, bacteria, insects, soil chemistry, over tens of thousands of years, they erase almost everything that can rot, warp, mold, or be chewed. So when we talk about Neanderthal technology, we're mostly talking about the half that fossilizes. The other half, you have to reconstruct gently from impressions left behind. That carved spear from Schoeningen, for example, predates classic Neanderthals, but shows what humans of this broader lineage could do with wood. A long, carefully balanced shaft, tip carved from the denser heartwood, shaped so its weight and aerodynamics make sense in the hand. Later, at sites that do fall squarely in Neanderthal time, we find sharpened wooden points and digging sticks preserved in waterlogged sediments. Microscopic analysis shows the tips were deliberately shaped, sometimes fire-hardened. It would be strange if those rare finds were the only wooden objects ever made. More likely, they are the survivors of a much larger family of things. Think about the day you've been following. Those stone points that were retouched by the fire are not much use without something to extend your reach. A hafted spear is, at heart, a shaped stick that has gone through several decisions: which branch to cut, how long to make it, how to straighten and smooth it, whether to char and scrape the tip or leave the stone to do the piercing. Handles are the same story. A scraper bound into a short wooden grip changes how force travels from hand to edge. It lets you use your whole arm instead of just your fingers. It spreads pressure and saves your skin when you're spending hours on a tough winter hide. And then there are the tools you never see in glass cases. The digging sticks used to pry up roots and tubers in late summer. The poles that support a windbreak outside a cave entrance. The racks for drying meat and hides. The simple levers and props used to move a heavy carcass or secure a pile of firewood against rolling away on frozen ground. All of that is woodworking. We know Neanderthals were doing it because their stone tools, remember. Edges with wear polish and micro scars that only come from repeated contact with wood fibres, from prying and shaving and cutting. Experimental archaeologists take replicas, carve logs and branches, and then compare the resulting microscopic patterns. The match is strong, fibre is even more elusive, but the hints are there. When a spear point is hafted, stone and wood are not enough. Something has to tie it together, to clamp the joint while the resin cools or to reinforce a notch. Today we talk very casually about bindings, but every binding is an answer to a quiet engineering question. What can be twisted into cord here, in this season? Plant fibres from best and bark, strips of rawhide cut from the edge of yesterday's skin, sinew teased out of an animal's leg, rolled and dried so it shrinks tight when it's wet and then desiccates. Actual Neanderthal-era cords almost never survive, but at a few extraordinary sites, impressions on hardened sediments, or tiny fragments clinging to stone, show twisted fibres in 2 or 3 ply strands. A recent find from a French Neanderthal context revealed a tiny piece of 3-ply cord made from tree bark fibres, simple by modern standards, but requiring an understanding that fibres can be separated, twisted one way, then plied together the other way so the whole structure holds. Even that small scrap tells you something very large, that someone knew not only how to twist a single string, but how to control tension, direction, and sequence. Those same skills scale out into nets, snares, and carrying straps. We don't have Neanderthal nets in our collections. What we do have are bones of small animals in quantities and patterns that suggest mass capture, not individual hunting. We have stones with edge wear consistent with cutting plant fibres again and again. We have the logic of the situation. In a world where calories are hard won, tools that let you catch multiple fish in a river bend, or a flock of birds in a thicket, or rabbits that follow the same paths, are worth the effort. It's reasonable, though still a hypothesis, to picture some groups setting out woven traps in the evening and checking them in the morning, just as they recheck the condition of spears and scrapers. It's reasonable to imagine mesh bags or slings braided from plant fibre, used to carry gathered plants or chunks of meat. Not proven in detail, but compatible with everything we do see, and with what closely related humans later made. Water, cold, and wind keep turning up across this day as background conditions, but for Neanderthals they are also design constraints. How do you keep a hide shelter from flapping itself to pieces when the winter wind comes hard down the valley? You need strong ties at the corners, flexible enough to bend but not snap. How do you dry meat safely without letting it be carried off or spoiled? You need racks that stand above damp ground, with strips hung so that smoke and air can circulate. How do you cross a stream in early spring when the ice is thinning, but the water will kill you in minutes if you fall in? Perhaps a pole to test each step, a handhold lashed between trees, a temporary bridge built from logs and branches wedged and tied. None of those problem-solving sessions leave a clear fossil. But again, the indirect traces accumulate. Wear on tools from cutting and trimming wood, residues of plant fibres, the layout of hearths and post holes, and the simple observation that people survived in environments where negligence would have been fatal. So, when we imagine what Neanderthals did all day, the picture is incomplete if it stops at stone. Around the fire, between hunts, in those stretches of the afternoon when the light is still good, many hands are busy with tasks that leave no obvious trace, twisting fibres, testing the spring of a freshly cut sapling, smoothing the inside of a wooden bowl with hot stones and water, tying, untying, retying. What we can say with confidence is that they lived in landscapes that demanded constant small acts of engineering. What we infer, cautiously, is that their technological world was richer, softer, and more flexible than the stone record alone suggests. And all of that unseen technology feeds directly into the next part of the day. What happens when the meat and plants and bones and water come home, and the real work of turning food into a shared meal begins? The first sign that the hunt went well is sound. Not shouting, not cheering. More like a shift in the texture of the camp's noise. Murmured voices pick up. There's movement in and out of the firelight. Children edge closer and are told gently or firmly to give space. Then the carcass appears. Archaeology doesn't give us the sight of it being dragged in, or the smell, but it does give us the aftermath. In rock shelters and open sites across Ice Age Europe and Western Asia, Neanderthal layers are full of bones with very particular scars. Long bones from legs and upper arms, cracked open lengthwise. Spiral fractures that only happen when fresh bone is twisted hard, not when it dries and crumbles on its own. Fine parallel cut marks near joints and muscle attachments where stone edges sliced tendons and peeled away meat. Impact notches on marrow-rich bones where someone struck precisely with a hammerstone to split them. This is butchery as a sequence, not a random dismantling. First, the big pieces, the quarters separated at the hip and shoulder, heads and lower legs removed. Then muscle groups are taken off in slabs, following the grain of the animal the way a modern butcher does. Tendons are sliced carefully where they anchor to bone, both to free the meat and to harvest sinew for future bindings. Even the smaller scraps are shaved away from ribs and vertebrae. You can see this choreography when archaeologists map bones in 3 dimensions. Certain areas of a cave floor end up with concentrated piles of specific parts. Here a cluster of limb bones broken into standardized lengths. There are a scatter of vertebrae and ribs with cut marks but no breakage. Further away a discard heap of skull fragments. It suggests distinct tasks, sometimes even distinct work spots. A place to disarticulate, a place to strip, a place to crack. Once the meat is off the bone, it meets fire. Neanderthal hearths show up as shallow basins of reddened earth and charcoal, sometimes layered one over another as fires were built in the same patch of ground for years. Within and around these features burned bone is common, some pieces lightly singed, others calcined white from intense heat. That variability tells you something about cooking methods. Roasting is the simplest picture. Strips of meat skewered on wooden spits propped over embers, chunks laid on flat stones at the fire's edge and turned now and then. Many burned bones are from the outer portions of limbs, where someone has roasted meat close enough to flame that drippings char and flare. In some sites, the pattern of heat alteration on stone suggests they were used repeatedly as hot plates, heated in the coals and then raked aside to cook on. There is also evidence pointing to more indirect methods. Heat-cracked stones, especially when found in abundance near hearths, can be part of a different technique, dropping hot rocks into containers to heat water or cook stews. We don't have Neanderthal pots, but containers can be skin bags, wooden troughs, even bark-lined pits. Hot stones go in, water simmers, meat and gathered plants soften together. In a few cases, archaeologists find basin-shaped features with a mix of fire-reddened earth, stones and food refuse that may be the ghost of such cooking pits. Pit roasting is another possibility. A shallow depression lined with heated stones, filled with wrapped meat and perhaps roots, then covered with earth to trap heat. It leaves less tidy traces, but the combination of burned stones, bones with slow-cook cracking patterns, and the simple physics of wanting to soften tough tissue in a cold world all make it a plausible part of the repertoire. Whatever the exact recipes, one theme is clear: very little of a valuable animal is left unused. In lean seasons, fat is life. Neanderthal sites show an intense focus on marrow-rich elements. Femurs, humeri, metapodials split to expose the inner core. The fracture patterns are so consistent that experiments can reproduce them. A heavy stone hammer, a stable anvil, a practice swing that opens the bone without shattering the marrow into the dirt. Skull fragments, too, often bear cut marks and percussion scars. Brains, high in fat, are accessible if you know where to strike. Tongues, cheeks, organ meats like liver and heart. These leave fewer direct traces, but the processing marks on the surrounding bones show that heads and torsos were not simply discarded. Even spongy bones that are harder to eat directly can be rendered. In some Neanderthal layers, archaeologists find a high proportion of fragmented, heavily processed bone alongside hearths. One interpretation is bone grease extraction, smashing cancellous bone, heating it to separate out fat that can be skimmed and stored in skin containers, a dense energy source for days when hunting fails. This kind of thoroughness is not about greed, it is about risk. In Ice Age environments, calories are unpredictable. One successful kill might have to cover many future failures. The way food is processed and shared becomes a survival technology as real as any spear point. And this is where the social part of the meal begins. Anthropologists studying modern hunter-gatherers find that meat is almost never simple private property. There are rules, sometimes very explicit, sometimes more like strong expectations, about who gets what. Hunters may have prestige, but they don't just walk away with all the choicest cuts. Distribution flows along lines of kinship, obligation, and reciprocity. We cannot interview Neanderthals about their rules, but the pattern of bones at many sites suggests that large animals were brought back to central places and processed there, not eaten in isolation at the kill site. The dense accumulations of remains in shared living areas tell of group meals. In such a world, refusing to share in a time of plenty could mean being refused when you are the one who comes back empty-handed. Over hundreds of lifetimes, groups that institutionalize sharing, even informally, would have an edge. The risk of any one person's bad luck is buffered by the group's pooled success. Sharing also avoids fights. Clear expectations about who receives the first portion, which pieces customarily go to elders, nursing mothers, or allies, can smooth over potential conflict when hunger sharpens tempers. We can't see those etiquettes directly, but the mere fact that large groups live together for years in tight spaces implies some system for keeping peace around the most charged resource of all. By the time the light is fading and the meat is properly cooked, the frantic busyness of the kill and the butchery has slowed. Children are called in, portions are handed around. Near the hearths, the work of the day is briefly transformed into something else. Evenings are when skills are passed on almost without anyone naming them. A teenager watches how an experienced hand tests a piece of roast for doneness, or how someone angles a bone to crack it without losing the marrow. A small child gnaws on a rib while listening half distractedly to a story about a hunt from years ago, a storm survived, a place now abandoned. The archaeological record does not preserve the laughter, the arguments, the pauses between sentences. But we can see that people kept coming back to the same hearths, generation after generation, layering ash and bone and charcoal. Around those small islands of warmth, the day's activities resolve into a nightly rhythm, eating, talking, gazing into coals, maybe mending a tool or two in the glow. Food, in this setting, is not only fuel, it is a daily anchor that pulls scattered tasks and separate efforts into a single moment of togetherness. And when the last marrow has been sucked from the last cracked bone, and the fire is coaxed into a steady, low burn for the night, another set of technologies comes back into focus. The shelters that hold in the heat, the hides and fibres that keep bodies warm against the coming cold. For Neanderthals, warmth was not a background comfort, it was a daily project. When the fire is banked for the night and the last sparks are settling, where do these people actually sleep? In caves and rock shelters, the answer might seem obvious. They lie down on the floor. But archaeologists know that floor is doing a lot of work there. Under the modern dust and the layers of later deposits, Neanderthal occupations often resolve into distinct surfaces. Thin lenses of ash and charcoal, trampled bone fragments, patches rich in plant remains that might be the ghosts of bedding. Sometimes there are rings or arcs of stones around these areas. Not huge walls, but low alignments marking the edge of a windbreak or the perimeter of a hearth zone. In open-air sites where caves were not available, the clues are subtler. Circles of cobbles, patterns of post holes, dark circular stains where wooden poles once stood, arranged in arcs or ovals. These are the fingerprints of structures that have long since vanished. Hide tents, brush shelters, lean-tos braced against the prevailing wind. Spatial patterning helps us see the layout. Hearths in one zone, napping debris in another, sleeping or resting areas slightly apart, sometimes lined with softer materials. In a few sites, dense mats of plant phytoliths and microscopic charcoal intermixed suggest people were laying down armfuls of grasses or leaves, then replacing them often enough that the floor built up in layers. That's not a random sleep wherever you fall, that's maintenance. Over that bedding, over those tired bodies, there are hides. We know Neanderthals were skilled at taking apart animals. Hideworking is the logical next step, and there are hints of it everywhere. Cut marks on animal bones show skinning patterns as clear as a modern tanner's. Scrapers, the classic hide-working tools, are common in Neanderthal assemblages, their edges worn and polished in a way that matches experimental use on wet skin and fat. What those hides became is the harder question. One image is simple: large skins draped over shoulders like cloaks, wrapped around sleeping bodies, thrown over frameworks as rough tents. This doesn't require sewing. Holes can be poked with awls. Thongs can be twisted from sinew or plant fibres and used to tie, lace and cinch. A few well-placed knots turn a limp sheet of hide into a garment that stays on during movement. Another image is more complex: fitted clothing. Parka-like upper garments with sleeves, leggings tied at the waist, moccasin-style shoes with shaped soles. In cold climates, especially the severe cold of some Ice Age phases, this kind of tailored insulation can make the difference between frostbite and functioning hands. What does the evidence say? Bone needles with eyes, those unmistakable icons of sewing, do not show up in the record until later, mostly with Homo sapiens. In classic Neanderthal sites, they are conspicuously absent. It would be easy to jump from that absence to a confident claim: no needles, no tailored clothing. But reality is more slippery. Neanderthals did have pointed tools: awls, punch-like implements, sharpened bone and antler. These can pierce hide and guide a thong through, without leaving the kind of formal needle archaeologists love to display. They also had time, skill, and strong social reasons to experiment with ways of keeping children, elders, and hunters warm. So we are left with probabilities rather than certainties. Draped, wrapped, and tied garments are almost guaranteed. The cut mark patterns and toolware make that hard to deny. Tailoring in the strict sense, complex fitted seams, multi-part garments, remains unproven, but it is difficult to rule out, especially in the later parts of the Neanderthal timeline, when climates were harshest and contact with other human groups was possible. Some researchers even argue that the sheer success of Neanderthals in cold regions implies clothing more sophisticated than simple capes. Whatever form their clothing took, once you bundle bodies, fires, and damp hides into shelter, a new set of problems appears. Smoke, for one. Hearths in enclosed or semi-enclosed spaces need management. Too much smoke and eyes water, lungs burn, infection risk rises. Too little fire, and everyone freezes. Archaeological hearths often sit near natural vents, cave mouths, cracks, the places where airflow would be best. In open sites, structures seem oriented with attention to prevailing winds, letting smoke draft away without stripping all the heat. Moisture is another enemy. Fresh hides are wet, and humans are constantly breathing, sweating, spilling liquids. In cold conditions, dampness is dangerous. Rot, mould, and chill creep in together. This is where those maintenance chores matter again. Dragging out old bedding, bringing in new plant material, hanging hides to dry near but not directly over the flames, turning them regularly. The archaeology shows repeated reworking of floor surfaces, patches of trampled ash mixed with new plant inputs, a quiet rhythm of cleaning and replacing. Then there are the smallest campmates, parasites, lice, fleas, mites. These flourish where warmth, hair, cloth, and bedding coexist. We don't have fossil lice combs from Neanderthals, but we do have indirect evidence. Genetic studies of human parasites suggest they adapted to clothing-wearing hosts deep in the Pleistocene. likely in the time window when Neanderthals and early Homo sapiens were both around. The implication is stark. Wherever there is shelter, there is also itching. Managing that would have been yet another low-level constant job. Picking at seams, scratching, sharing knowledge of plants that repel insects when burned or rubbed on skin. Raking coals over old bedding to kill eggs, then laying fresh grasses on top. None of this leaves clear-cut dramatic traces, but the combination of dense living spaces and long-term occupation almost forces these behaviours into the daily routine. Across the year, shelter and clothing weren't static. They had seasons too. In winter, people might favour deeper caves, rock overhangs with good exposure, or well-built windbreaks in sheltered valleys. Hearths cluster. Structures become more substantial. The archaeological layers thicker where snow and cold limited movement. Camps in such seasons may have been used year after year, slowly accumulating stone rings, compacted floors, and complex internal zoning, a kind of recurring winter home. Summer changes the calculus. When temperatures rise and animals and plants are more widely dispersed, mobility becomes easier. Groups can range farther, set up lighter shelters that leave fewer traces, a framework of poles and hides, a day or two in one spot, then on again. Clothing can shift too. Heavy furs might be left behind at favoured cold season sites, replaced with lighter wraps, or even near nakedness when labour is intense and the sun is high. Between these extremes lies the work that rarely makes it into heroic stories: repairs. Someone has to re-smoke a hide that's losing its water resistance. Someone has to retie lashings on a sagging roof pole, patch a hole worn through a sleeping skin, sharpen the scrapers dulled by hours of thinning and softening leather. These are not occasional crises, they are regular tasks threaded through afternoons and evenings. Picture the end of a long day, the fire low, the camp quieting. In the dim glow, a figure works a scraper along the inner surface of a hide, steady, rhythmic strokes. Another fingers a strip of sinew, testing where it will serve best as a tie. Nearby, someone shakes out bedding, sending dust into the smoky light, then spreads fresh plant stems on the floor. By the time everyone lies down, what feels like simple rest is actually the outcome of hundreds of practiced decisions. Where to build, how to orient the shelter, what to wear, when to repair. Staying warm in a Neanderthal world is not a background condition. It is the woven backdrop against which every other part of the day, hunting, gathering, talking, raising children, can happen at all. If you look at a Neanderthal camp and don't think about children, the whole place feels strangely empty. Archaeology has a way of doing that. Bones, tools, hearths, these skew toward adult activity, toward what leaves the clearest traces, but every so often the record tilts, and you can almost hear small feet. In a few sites there are footprints. At Le Rosel in France, for example, layers of ancient sand were preserved just right. When researchers mapped them, they found trackways from multiple individuals walking, standing, turning. Many of those feet were small, not toddlers barely able to walk, but children and adolescents moving with confidence, weaving in and out of adult paths, clustering near where fires and work areas would have been. It's a reminder that a Neanderthal camp is not just a workplace or a barracks. It's also a playground, a classroom, a daycare. Juvenile remains tell the same story from a different angle. They show up in burial contexts and in ordinary occupation layers, sometimes with signs of long-term survival after illness or injury. That means kids weren't just present, they were cared for, fed, carried, protected, treated when something went wrong. During the day, though, they are not tucked away. They are in the middle of it. Imagine a morning once the first chill has been pushed back by the fire. Adults move toward their tasks, some preparing to hunt, some getting ready to gather plants or firewood, others tending hides and tools near the hearths. The children occupy the spaces between. The youngest stay closest to the warm centre, within quick reach of parents, siblings, grandparents. They toddle among bones and scraps of bark, picking up whatever their hands can close around. Older kids hover at the edges of activity zones, just far enough away not to be in the way, just close enough to see everything. For Neanderthals, learning is not happening in a separate school. It's leaking out of every action adults take. An experienced napper sits near the fire, turning a block of stone in their hands, striking controlled blows to release sharp flakes. Around them, the ground accumulates a halo of shards. Somewhere just behind their shoulder, a child watches, utterly absorbed. They see the angle of the wrist, the way the eyes track lines in the stone. Hours of this, days of this, before they ever pick up a hammerstone in earnest. When they do try, the evidence is there. Many Neanderthal sites contain crude flakes, broken cores, oddly shaped fragments that look very much like beginners' work. It's tempting to see them as the products of juvenile practice, someone small, copying the rhythm but not yet the precision, under the occasional quiet correction of an adult. The same pattern likely plays out in other skills. Tracking, for instance, is not learned from a lecture. It's learned by walking behind someone who points with a chin or a knuckle, who pauses at a scuff in the soil or a bent blade of grass, and waits until the child sees it too. Safe fire use, likewise, is not an abstract rule. It's a series of bodily habits, where you can put your hand, how you move around a hearth, which sticks are safe to poke, how close embers can come to a hide without burning through. Play folds into all of this almost seamlessly. Throwing, for example, is both game and training. A group of children might spend an afternoon heaving sticks at a target, a protruding root, a post, a skull propped on a rock. Laughter when someone misses spectacularly. Cheers when a stick thunks home. Underneath the noise, muscles and nervous systems are tuning, judging distance, coordinating eyes and hands, building the strength and shoulder mechanics that, a few years later, will send spears into real flesh. Climbing is the same. Trees, boulders, low cliff faces around camp become informal gymnasiums. Scraped knees and calloused palms are the tuition fees. From a distance, it looks like aimless energy. From the perspective of survival, it's practice for moving over broken terrain, for scrambling up after a wounded animal, or down into a gully where water hides in a dry season. There are probably imitation hunts too. Children stalking each other between bushes, ambushing imaginary prey, whispering strategies they've overheard adults use on real drives. A broken stick stands in for a spear. A tossed clump of moss becomes a fatal strike. In the process, they rehearse the roles they'll one day take in earnest. Driver, flanker, closer with the killing thrust. And then there is purely social play. Teasing, sharing, secret jokes, little dramas over who gets which bone or whose turn it is at a favourite spot by the fire. These interactions are not trivial. They're where children learn the invisible rules of their group, how to apologise, when to assert themselves, when to yield. In a small band where cooperation can mean life or death, those lessons may matter as much as any hunting technique. All of this unfolds inside an invisible protective perimeter. Neanderthal environments are full of hazards. Steep drops, vast water, thorny thickets, predators drawn to the same resources humans seek. Even near camp there are dangers. Open hearths, sharp tools, half-butchered carcasses that could attract scavengers. Adult behaviour almost certainly maps onto that risk. The youngest kids probably stay near a central cluster of adults. Older children might be allowed to roam further, down to the stream in pairs, up over a low rise within sight of camp, but not beyond certain landmarks. Watchful eyes track them. Someone napping who also glances up every few moments, someone tending a pot or a hide while listening for the particular pitch of a child's cry that means real trouble, not just play. Predators complicate this further. In some periods and places, big carnivores, lions, hyenas, bears, share the landscape and occasionally the same caves. Neanderthals show signs of direct confrontations with these animals. It's hard to imagine that not shaping how they manage their most vulnerable members, so maybe there is an informal schedule. When hunters are gone and the camp is lightly staffed, the kids stay tighter, closer to the fire and the inner walls of the shelter. When more adults are present, when sentries of a sort are scanning the horizon, the radius of children's play expands. It's a dynamic, constantly renegotiated bubble of safety. Seeing the day through children's eyes changes the meaning of what Neanderthals did all day. It's no longer just about acquiring calories and maintaining tools. It's about transmitting a way of life, hour by hour, almost without naming it. Every errand becomes a lesson. Every chore sets up a teaching moment. Every game doubles as rehearsal for some future challenge. The camp in this light is not primarily a hunting base or a workshop. It's a place where new humans are being made, where the skills, stories and habits that kept the group alive are soaked up by small bodies that spend their days running, watching, imitating and laughing within earshot of crackling fires. If you look more closely at those same camps, another pattern starts to emerge. Neanderthals get hurt. A lot. Their skeletons read like medical charts. Healed fractures in ribs, arms, legs, vertebrae. compressed spines that speak of heavy loads carried over years, skulls and long bones with old impact damage that knit back together long before death. Some of those injuries would have been thoroughly disabling, at least for a while. A badly broken leg in an Ice Age landscape isn't a minor inconvenience. You can't keep up on a hunt, can't flee quickly if predators show up, can't range out to gather plants or wood. Left entirely on your own, you simply don't eat. And yet, in many Neanderthal remains, those bones did heal. Not perfect, not painless, but solid enough that the person lived months, sometimes years after the trauma. That survival implies something about what other people in the camp were doing all day. Care leaves no direct fossil, but it leaves circumstances that are hard to explain without it. Someone with a shattered leg has to be fed while they can't walk or hunt. They have to be helped to move around, to find shelter when the group shifts camp, to stay warm when they can't gather their own firewood. Wounds that don't immediately kill, deep cuts, punctures, bad sprains, need at least basic attention if they're not all going to turn septic. We can imagine a version of daily life shaped around that. Maybe there's an adult near the fire this morning who isn't there by choice. Their leg is bound with leather thongs and padded with moss or fur. They use a stick to shift position, teeth clenched when they move the wrong way. Around them, activity has been rearranged. Others bring food, marrow-rich bones split and roasted, soft organ meat, pounded roots and berries that don't require much chewing. Someone leans over, checks the swelling, wipes away pus or blood with water carried from the stream. Maybe they pack the wound with chewed herbs, or with dry plant fibres that wick away moisture. We don't know the exact remedies, but we do know that humans have been experimenting with plants and injuries for a long time. Care might also look less like nursing and more like quiet adjustment. An injured person might be given tasks that keep them useful to the group, without demanding mobility, tending the fire, shaving wood for spear shafts, twisting fibres into cord, watching small children. Their workload shifts away from high-risk, high-exertion hunts toward jobs they can do sitting down. That spreads the cost of their survival across many small acts, woven into everyone's day. Group size matters a lot here. A tiny band of 5 or 6 pushed to the edge of starvation may not always be able to support someone badly hurt. A somewhat larger, well-organized group with reliable food sources can. They can afford to let 1 or 2 adults be less productive for a season, especially if others can temporarily increase their effort. Cooperation isn't just a moral story, it shows up as cold arithmetic. The more people who can share the burden of hunting, gathering and watching for danger, the better the odds that a wounded member doesn't become a fatal drain. Archaeologists sometimes talk about costly individuals in small-scale societies. Neanderthal bones show that those costs were often paid. The same goes for teeth. Many Neanderthals died missing most or all of their molars, with the sockets remodelled and smoothed, clear signs that the teeth had been gone for years. Without grinding surfaces, chewing tough meat and fibrous roots would be extremely difficult. Yet these individuals lived well into what, for Neanderthals, counted as old age. One answer is ingenuity, using tools to process food more thoroughly, cooking things longer, cutting meat into very small pieces before eating. Another is social, other people deliberately providing softer foods, choosing parts of an animal or particular plants with them in mind. We have to be careful here. It's easy to romanticize, to imagine tender scenes that the evidence can't quite prove. Not every healed injury demands an image of devoted bedside vigils. Some fractures can knit if a person simply manages not to use the limb much for a while. A toothless individual might survive by leaning heavily on their own skills and on softer parts of the diet. But when you consider the sum of it, the severity of some injuries, the repeated pattern of long-term survival, the context of dangerous, physically demanding lives, it becomes increasingly plausible that active support was part of what Neanderthals did for each other, and that brings us to the people most likely to need that support, and most able to repay it in a different currency: elders. Neanderthals did not, on average, live as long as modern people in industrialized societies. Many died young, but some didn't. A proportion of individuals show wear on their joints, heavy tooth erosion, when they still have them, and other markers of age. These are people who have seen many winters. Picture one of them by the fire in the late afternoon. Their hands are knotted, maybe a shoulder doesn't quite lift the way it once did. They may no longer sprint in the front rank of a hunt, but their memory of landscape stretches back decades. They remember a valley where reindeer calve earlier than elsewhere, a cliffside with a nesting ledge that always seems to hold birds' eggs at a certain time of year, a hollow where water lingers in dry summers, a stand of particular shrubs whose bark makes the best bindings if you harvest it at just the right season. When the group debates where to move next, these recollections suddenly matter more than brute strength. An elder can recall bad years, that one late storm that froze animals on the move, the time a certain river flooded and cut off a favoured route, the season when berries failed on one slope but thrived on another. In a world where climate swings and animal migrations can change the rules quickly, long memory can be a survival tool as concrete as any spear. They also carry technique. Their hands remember the right pressure to shape a tricky stone core, the rhythm for twisting sinew into strong thread, the exact moment in cooking when marrow begins to bubble but not burn. They have seen arrows splinter, fires go out at the wrong moment, shelters collapse under wet snow. Each failure, each near miss, becomes a story that can be told, a warning that can be passed on. Around the hearth, these stories leak into daily chatter. A child asks why a spear point is made this way and not that, and the answer includes a tale of the time someone tried the other style and lost a wounded animal in the dark. A younger hunter returns empty-handed, and an older voice reminds them of a wind shift they forgot to consider, something that had fooled them too long ago. All of this depends on the elder being there. To keep them there, others probably do for them what they once did for the injured: share food, share warmth, adjust workloads. The cost of keeping an older adult who may contribute less in calories is offset by the information they provide: the mental map of the landscape, the calendar of plants and animals, the tricks for making tools last longer and injuries hurt less. Again, we can't say this with absolute certainty for every Neanderthal group, in every place and time. Some bands may have lost elders suddenly, some may have been too strained to support them through long declines. But the combination of aged skeletons, evidence of survival after trauma, and the clear advantages of hanging on to experienced minds all point in a similar direction. In Neanderthal daily life, care is not an occasional extra. It is built into the fabric of the group, in the way they share meat, in who stays behind with the injured, in how much space they make for those who can no longer run fast but can still remember far. When night comes and everyone drifts back toward the fire, you can see the results gathered together. Children leaning against parents, a hunter with a stiffened limb stretching it out toward the heat, an elder speaking quietly while younger faces listen. The band is not just a collection of strong bodies, it is a web of dependence and memory, holding its members through injury, through aging, through the long uncertainties of an Ice Age world. As the light fades and the fire takes over as the main source of warmth and vision, something else comes into focus too: the way these people actually relate to one another. We can start with what their bodies and genes will allow us to say, and then move very carefully beyond it. Neanderthals share the same basic vocal equipment we do. The bones of the throat and ear that survive in the fossil record suggest an ability to perceive and produce a wide range of sounds, including many of the frequencies human speech uses. Their tongues sat in mouths framed by complex teeth and jaws. Their brains, as far as we can tell from endocasts, had regions corresponding to areas in our own that are involved in language processing. Genetic evidence points the same way. Neanderthals carry versions of genes associated in us with speech and language, including FOXP2. That doesn't prove they spoke like we do, or had the same kind of grammar or vocabulary, but it makes it increasingly unlikely that they were limited to a handful of crude grunts. If you pause here by the night fire and let that sink in, the scene shifts. All around the circle, communication is happening on several channels at once. Some of it might be speech in a sense we would recognize, short, clipped phrases traded between hunters as they reconstruct the day's chase, or murmurings between partners as they settle children to sleep. The details of Neanderthal syntax are beyond us, and may always be, but it's hard to imagine a life this complex without words for here, there, wait, again, you, me, now. Yet words are only part of it. Hands move constantly. A hunter replays the moment a bison turned by sketching its path in the air, then in the dirt, tracing hoofbeats and wind direction. Someone demonstrates how close a spear came to missing by holding two fingers barely apart. A child is corrected wordlessly. A hand on the wrist, a shake of the head, a small reenacted mistake with a tool followed by the right way. Rhythm runs through this as well. Quiet tasks, scraping hides, twisting fibre, chipping at a stone core, create a background beat that others fall into almost without thinking. Shared routines have their own cadence. The group knows when it's time to add more wood, when the last meat needs turning, when children should be shushed a little because predators might be nearer in the dark. Cooperation in such a small band isn't optional, it's survival. But close living also breeds friction. Somewhere near the edge of the firelight there may be a pair who aren't speaking. A hunt went badly, someone felt slighted, a promise to share a hide or a tool was not kept exactly as expected. In groups of 20 or so, you can't simply avoid each other and hope the problem disappears. Tension has to be managed. Maybe that happens through direct confrontation, raised voices, sharp gestures, others glancing over alert. Maybe more often it happens in softer, ritualized ways. A piece of meat passed deliberately to the person you're angry with, a small joke at your own expense, a story told by an elder that is obviously about something that happened long ago, but also very clearly about the disagreement unfolding tonight. The same fire that witnesses conflict also strengthens bonds. Social ties here are layered. There are intimate pairings, long-term mates who share sleeping spaces, food, the care of children. There is the broader web of kin, siblings, cousins, in-laws by whatever rules they recognize. Beyond that, there are the faint threads that stretch out into the darkness beyond this camp. Neanderthals did not live entirely cut off from one another. Over years and generations, groups likely met at certain places and seasons, a path that herds always cross, a flint source that's too valuable to leave to chance. Individuals might move between bands as mates, or after disputes, or simply as part of the slow mixing that keeps small populations genetically healthy. Around the fire, that wider network appears in casual remarks. Someone mentions a cousin in another valley who naps stone in a slightly different way. A child asks about a distinctive shell bead, and hears that it came from people far to the south, where the sea is closer. A visitor from a neighbouring band sits a little apart at first, watched and watching, slowly drawn into the current of conversation and routine. Exchange is possible even when no goods are changing hands tonight. Information is traded, where herds have been seen, which river ice is thinning, which slope still holds berries under the snow. Jokes and gestures spread too, small cultural markers that can link distant camps that only meet every few years. And then, as the flames sink lower, as the younger children finally stop resisting sleep, talk thins out. Night is social time, but it is not always noisy. Some tasks continue in near silence. Someone feeds the fire, prodding embers, adding small sticks so the wood doesn't crackle too loudly. A hide is stretched and pinned with slow, economical movements. A weapon is checked, its edge tested with a thumb. In the pauses between words, there is space for something like storytelling, even if it doesn't follow our patterns. An elder might begin with a simple reference, the cold year, or the time of the broken ice. And everyone immediately knows which story is being summoned. They add details slowly in low tones, where the group was then, who still living now was just a baby, who died. Hands moved to trace routes taken, storms endured. A younger adult might interrupt to ask a question, or to compare it to a more recent bad winter. These aren't just entertainments, they're how memory is kept. Around countless fires, over hundreds of years, the landscape is narrated into the group's shared mind. Cliffs and streams and peculiar boulders become anchored to episodes. This is where the great aurochs fell. This is where the ice cracked under your uncle's feet. This is the hollow that never quite freezes, even when everything else does. Children half asleep absorb these associations without having to remember the details. Adults refine them, correct each other gently when someone misremembers a direction or a season. In this way, knowledge moves forward in time, carried by voices and gestures, and by the silences that let important things sink in. Eventually the talk dwindles to a murmur, then to almost nothing. Only the occasional cough, a shift of weight on packed earth, a log collapsing into embers. Under the stars of an ice-age sky, the social life of the band settles into breathing, warmth, the unconscious proximity of bodies that have chosen for now to trust one another with the dark. This, as much as any tool or hunt, is what they did all day and all night, negotiated the delicate balance between self and group, between word and silence, until morning light pulled them outward again. When you watch them sleeping, or almost sleeping, it's tempting to imagine the scene as purely practical. Warmth, safety, shared body heat. But the longer you sit with them in your mind, the harder it is to keep ritual out of the picture. This is where we step onto thin ice. Archaeologists have been arguing for decades about whether Neanderthals had religion, or believed in an afterlife, or made art. The trouble is that stones and bones are stubbornly literal, meaning doesn't fossilize very well. Start with burials. At several Neanderthal sites, skeletons are found in positions that look, to our eyes, intentional. Bodies laid on their sides, limbs drawn up, heads cradled by natural depressions or stone. In a few cases, the graves seem to have been dug into existing cave floors, then filled in after the body was placed. Sometimes there are objects near the dead, animal bones, stone tools, fragments of pigment. Does that prove anything about belief? Not by itself. Some of these burials might just be places where a body happened to fall, then was quickly covered by mud or ceiling collapse. Animals can drag bones around and rearrange them in ways that look surprisingly human. What look like grave goods could be ordinary campsite debris that just happened to end up near the corpse. So researchers go site by site, layer by layer, asking the same cautious questions. Is there clear evidence of a pit? Are the bones still articulated or scattered? Do the associated objects appear deliberately placed, or are they part of a general trash layer? The answers vary. A few cases look strongly intentional, many are ambiguous. Some early claims have been quietly walked back. The same pattern appears when we move to pigments, feathers, claws, and markings. Red and yellow ochre turn up at some Neanderthal sites, far from the sources where those minerals naturally occur. Bird bones show cut marks in places that suggest feathers were removed carefully, not for meat. Eagle talons and carnivore claws appear with wear patterns that hint at being strung or handled repeatedly. These are, in themselves, not tools for hunting or cooking. They hint at ornament, display, or some kind of signalling. Yet here again, the record resists simple stories. Not every pigment stain is body paint. Not every claw with a groove is a necklace. Natural processes can mimic human modification. Humans can use a striking object once, then never attach much shared meaning to it. Extraordinary claims about symbolic life in deep prehistory need extraordinary context. Repeated patterns across sites, clear association with particular activities, strong evidence that we're not just looking at chance. Within those limits, though, it's hard not to see the emotional pressures that might have pushed Neanderthals toward ritual. Grief is one of them. We know they cared for injured individuals over long periods. Some skeletons show severe disabilities that would have required sustained help. When those people finally died, it is difficult to imagine their bodies treated as mere refuse. Even without complex theology, a group can mark a death in ways that feel ritualized, choosing a particular spot, arranging the body in a familiar posture, placing a valued object in the crook of an arm or under a hand, returning to that place later, and remembering. Identity is another force. Feathers in the hair, ochre on the skin, a particular claw tied at the wrist. These could have signalled membership in a band, achievement in a hunt, ties to a mate or a lineage. The repetition of such markers, over seasons and across generations, would slowly turn habit into something closer to ceremony. And then there is simple group cohesion. When you live on a knife edge with 20 other people, shared gestures that say, "We belong together," are powerful. A chant before a dangerous hunt, a quiet, patterned way of welcoming visitors or reconciling quarrels, a certain call made at the first snowfall or at the return of a migratory herd. We have almost no direct evidence for these specific acts. Here, we've stepped beyond what the ground can show us and into structured speculation, anchored only by what we know of human psychology and by those suggestive pigments, feathers, and bones. So, as you sit with them in the dark, it's useful to hold two thoughts at once. First, we must not project every modern ritual backward just because we find the idea appealing. The data are thin, the debates are real. Some famous Neanderthal altars and flower burials probably weren't. Second, we also shouldn't strip their nights down to nothing but meat and sleep. The same minds that tracked herds, cared for the injured, and told stories about past winters were surely capable of marking certain moments as special, certain places as charged, certain objects as more than just useful. Exactly how they did that, we may never know. But somewhere between the hard edge of the evidence and the soft territory of possibility, There is room to let curiosity rest gently, and to imagine, carefully labelled as imagination, a Neanderthal world that included not just tools and talk, but something like meaning. By morning, the pigments, the feathers, the claws, if they're there at all, will just look like part of the day's gear again. But under the surface of their routine, threads of ritual may already be binding this small, vulnerable band a little more tightly together. By the time the morning meal is gone and the embers have been nudged back into life, the band has to step out into a world that is not just cold and beautiful, but crowded with risk. Some dangers are impersonal, a misstep on icy rock, a patch of rotten snow over a crevasse, a falling branch from a wind-twisted tree. In a landscape of cliffs, caves and rivers edged with frost, the line between a normal day and a broken leg is very thin. For a creature that lives by walking, carrying and climbing, one bad fall can be the beginning of the end. Some dangers have teeth: hyenas, lions, wolves, cave bears. Depending on the place and the exact time, Neanderthals shared their hunting grounds with predators that were faster, sharper, or simply more numerous. Most days this meant a kind of mutual wariness. They avoided fresh lion kills, lions avoided organised bands of shouting, armed apes. Every so often the balance failed. Neanderthal bones with bite marks and chewing damage tell us that sometimes they were eaten, and some dangers came from each other. Skulls with healed, depressed fractures, ribs with punctures that might be from a spear or a thrown point, cuts on forearms in places that look uncomfortably like defensive wounds. These are part of the fossil record too. Do they mean constant warfare? Probably not. If Neanderthal life had been an unbroken chain of raids and ambushes, we'd expect much higher rates of traumatic injury, more burned layers that look like sacked camps, more clear signs of organised mass killing. Instead, what we see is a mix. Some individuals with serious but healed injuries, others with none at all, scattered hints of interpersonal violence folded into a much larger pattern of hunting accidents and predator encounters. In small groups under constant environmental pressure, arguments can flare into blows. A dispute over food, mates or territory might end with a stone tool thrown harder than intended. Yet the same smallness that makes conflict dangerous also forces peace. You cannot easily lose half your adult hunters to a feud when winter is coming. Looming beyond these familiar risks is a stranger kind of danger. Other humans who are not quite us. By the last 100,000 years or so, Neanderthals are not alone in Eurasia. Modern humans have begun to move out of Africa in waves. For tens of thousands of years, their ranges overlap, especially in the Levant and parts of Western Eurasia. Genetic evidence tells us that, at least sometimes, they met close enough to have children together. What does that look like on an ordinary day? You can imagine a hunting party cresting a ridge and seeing unexpected smoke rising in the distance. Not the thin plume of a lightning-struck tree, but the low, steady haze of another band's fire. Shapes moving against the snow line, voices that sound almost like your own, but with unfamiliar rhythms. The first response is probably not a charge, it is distance. They might shadow each other for hours or days, reading tracks, counting footprints, how many adults, how many children, what they carry, where they sleep. They might leave signs, broken branches, arranged stones, a piece of carcass left deliberately on a path as a way of testing intentions. Some encounters would dissolve in mutual avoidance, each group veering away, choosing different valleys, following different herds. Others may have edged toward cautious signalling, standing in the open with weapons visible but lowered, mimicked gestures, shared laughter at a clumsy mistake, perhaps an object held up, then set down between them, a piece of flint from a distant source, a shell, a lump of pigment. Trade in such moments is not just about goods, it is about reducing uncertainty. A point of red ochre for a length of sinew is also an exchange of information. We are not attacking you right now. We recognize your capacity to reciprocate. Still other meetings may have turned ugly. A misread movement, a panicked flight, a thrown spear. One band driving the other from a water source or a cave entrance they used last winter. Layered over years and generations, these encounters add up. Genes crossing between populations, tool styles blending or diverging, territories shifting. For Neanderthals, the cost of misjudging a stranger, whether animal or human, could be death. The cost of too much caution could be slow starvation, as better lands and easier routes were claimed by others. We know how the long arc of the story ends, as absorption into expanding Homo sapiens populations, or as extinction where no interbreeding occurred. But the path to that outcome wasn't one dramatic last stand. It was thousands upon thousands of days like this one, a decision to skirt that valley instead of crossing it, a tense meeting by a river that ends in shared meat rather than blood, a single child born from an unlikely pairing between bands. How many such ordinary, ambiguous days did it take for an entire way of being human to fade from the landscape, leaving only a trace in our bones and a handful of tools in the dirt? That is a question the fossils cannot answer, and one that still hangs quietly over every Neanderthal footprint we find. If you trace our Neanderthal day from morning to night, it settles into a rhythm that feels almost familiar. Wake up cold, check the fire, eat something simple, decide who hunts, who gathers, who stays with the children and the elders. Hours of walking, watching the sky and the tracks, weighing risk against hunger. Careful work with stone and wood and fibre, turning raw pieces of the world into things that cut, scrape, pierce and carry. Food shared out in the dim light, injuries checked, stories or memories passed along around the flames, drifting into sleep with danger close and other people closer still. That rhythm is built from different kinds of knowledge. Some parts come from hard evidence, cut marks on bones, soot in cave ceilings, pollen grains in dental plaque, healed fractures in skeletons, DNA fragments that tell us who lived where and with whom. Other parts are careful inference, drawn from how hunter-gatherers live in harsh environments today, from what it takes for a small population to survive winter after winter without vanishing. When this episode has said they probably, they may have, we can imagine. That's the boundary line, the place where data thins and we follow the most reasonable paths through the fog. Staying honest about that doesn't shrink the wonder. It's what makes the picture meaningful instead of make-believe. If you'd like more slow, detailed journeys into deep time, you can gently tap like or subscribe so you can find your way back here on another night. If you feel awake enough, you're welcome to leave a comment telling me where in the world you're listening from, and whether you'd have preferred a day of hunting, of tool-making, or of tending the fire. If this kind of quietly speculative prehistory soothes you, there's also a book of prehistoric secrets and deep-time stories waiting for you. You can read more about it, and pick up a copy if you'd like, at sleepytimehistory.com. For now, you can let the Neanderthal camp fade, the last coals of their fire dim to a soft red. The hunters and gatherers of a world long gone lie curled in furs and shadows, listening to the same wind and the same dark that once pressed against their shelters. You can imagine them breathing slowly, the night settling around them, the long cold stars turning overhead, and you can rest knowing that somewhere inside you, a trace of their endurance, their careful work and their ordinary fragile days is still here, still keeping watch as you drift towards sleep.